link I sent you?
The link. You sent it on WhatsApp?
Yes, I sent it on email. I can send it on WhatsApp as well. Sure. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Frontline Club today. We have a very important event, as we think, and so I'll keep this as short as I can. If it's your first time at the Frontline Club, welcome. Feel free to give us a follow on social media, subscribe to our newsletter, or grab a drink after the event. And if it's not your first time, maybe you want to become a member and help us do more events like these. And now, without further ado, it's my honor to give over to the panel and Tasha.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I hope you can all hear me. I can project, so don't worry. You join us on a breaking news scenario. And what kind of breaking news? My goodness, can we just have a big kudos to the Frontline Club team, to Nina and the gang, because I don't know how they knew Donald Trump and President Putin's diary in order to rally this conversation round on such an important day. Because let's face it, these two guys have spoken. They spoke for about 2.5 hours, depending on what the communique is, and we are here to talk about what on earth is going to happen now that arguably the United States has turned their back on the US, on Ukraine, and what do we do next? My name is Kasia Madera. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a BBC News presenter, so you will not be hearing my opinion, because that's not what it's all about. I am of Polish origin, so I do have a little bit of vested interest, but I have a fabulous, fabulous panel with me, and I do want you to be interactive. I want you to ask questions. We've got an esteemed cast with me, and these guys have just been filing, literally, also Catherine Philp, the Times World Affairs editor, one of the most experienced foreign correspondents. 5 continents in nearly 20 years for the Times, Catherine?
So it's updating.
Absolutely. And well, you're too busy. It's the thing, isn't it? When you're busy, you're just too busy. And Catherine has just been filing for Times Radio. So thank you very much for just taking a moment to speak to us. Nina dos Santos. I think, Nina, you've worked for every single major broadcaster ever. You're a regular guest on BBC News. You're a regular guest on the BBC, and we are very grateful for all your comments. And you've got a brilliant podcast with, I think, the best title in the world, Control, Alt, Deceit. Isn't that fantastic? And we're also very, very thrilled to have Sune Rasmussen, who is a correspondent who, for the Wall Street Journal, you cover everything. You've covered the fall of Kabul, you've just come back from Greenland, you focus on terrorism, on security, on, well, very much on Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are in very good hands. But back to the breaking news, because Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin have had their conversation, and we live in a world of 2 different truths right now. Because if you look at the communique that the Kremlin has issued, it is very, very, very different to the communique that has been issued by the White House. Surprise, surprise. So I don't know who's across it, and I'm not going to dwell too long on this, but just the main headlines are, and I promise not to be the person running in with loads of bits of paper, and here I am. The Kremlin have said that Ukraine, any kind of ceasefire agreement, and we're not even talking about a peace plan here, any kind of ceasefire agreement needs to see the stopped forced mobilization in Ukraine and to stop the rearming of Ukrainian forces. They want attention to be drawn to, in the Kremlin's words, the barbaric terrorist crimes committed by Ukrainian militants against the civil population in the Kursk region. What is wonderful about the Frontline Club is, when I'm on the news, I don't assume knowledge. I know you guys know everything that's happening, so I don't have to explain. But for those of you, maybe the Kursk region is, of course, the region within Russia that Ukraine took control of, a small, very, very small part. And also the mutual refrain from strikes on energy infrastructure facilities for 30 days. So that is one of the similarities I could find. The US, the White House, said there needs to be a peace. There needs to be a lasting peace, and they want to see improved US-Russia relations, and again, that energy and infrastructure ceasefire. Catherine, we were just talking about this. The 2 different conversations were being had. I don't know what was lost in translation, but these are 2 different events.
It's absolutely extraordinary. So yeah, I had just got the US the White House readout and was on Times Radio, and they started reading into me the Kremlin lines, and I didn't know for sure at that point whether the Kremlin was claiming that it had got these agreements. But then when you look at the Kremlin version, you can see that what they're doing is they're not just announcing what was agreed or what came out of it. They're very strategically putting out there all the things that they want to happen. So they're sort of making them sound like they were an official part of the discussion, even if they were only things that that Putin raised. So some of them are absolutely classic Kremlin talking points. And if we go back to when Trump first called Zelensky a dictator and came out with all that stuff, and Zelensky responded by saying, he lives in a misinformation bubble. This is what we're talking about. It's these lines. And when you hear Trump saying them, it's usually right after he's just spoken to Putin. So it's talking about these barbaric crimes in Kursk. In fact, great piece on The Wire today from the Russian side of that, of civilians who'd been in that Ukrainian-controlled area of Kursk for these 8 months or so, and now they've come out. And they were being questioned, and they were saying, oh no, the Ukrainians were really nice, they helped us get water and all of these things. So this is just sort of epic misinformation. But I think what's really important to look at is the fact that these two statements, they are just so far apart, and what was agreed was so slender, and we're really grasping at straws here. It is so much less than the US had proposed and that Ukraine had agreed to, and all of that. So, here we are. Donald Trump is getting a taste of exactly how difficult negotiating the end or even a temporary pause in a conflict can be.
So, and there's no signature, nothing's been signed again. So the latest, it's breaking news, but it's arguably non-news, because Nina, again, this is something. He talks the talk, Donald Trump, he's got them in a conversation, right? You've got to give him something, but the outcomes, the results are not really worth anything.
Well, it depends who you're marketing the statement to, because it's very clear that the reason why these two statements are so different is because they're being marketed to their own individual domestic audiences. And of course, what's crucial about this whole conversation is that the key players, like Ukraine itself, the country over which they're talking, is not party to them. Neither is the European Union, that is fearing that the war could bleed over into their borders, or NATO, by the way, and I'm sure we'll come to that in this discussion. So obviously, these are statements that are being marketed towards a domestic audience in the United States. My experience covering international news stories for the big US broadcasters, as you were saying, Kasia, is that they get very limited airtime. The nuance and detail that Catherine was just talking about in the Russian statement probably isn't there in the US statement, because Donald Trump went into these negotiations making it very clear that he wanted a win that he had to sell back to the US people. So he's got something that he can take back to the table to say, look, hey, I'm an action man. I'm already managing to do something, even if it's temporary. And also, as you'd expect with Donald Trump, this is transactional. What they're talking about here is energy. This is the language of money. It's a language that he feels the American people have voted him in on, and that they can understand, irrespective of whether or not these negotiations are really about peace in Ukraine.
Yeah, and it's that term, isn't it, transactional? You keep hearing it. He's the art of the deal. He's going to close the deal. He's talking about the power plants in Zaporizhia. He's talking about the potential taking on of Canada as the 51st state of the US. And he's talking about the buying up of Greenland. And Sune, you've just come back from Greenland. So how on earth do Greenlanders feel about this?
I mean, there's a great desire in Greenland for independence across the board. Like what that independence looks like, when it's going to happen, how the negotiations with Copenhagen will, because obviously Greenland is part of Denmark, and that's who they want independence from. All that is up for debate. But the fact that I think 95% of Greenlanders, something like that, want independence, right? So there was a potential opening for the Americans to come in and influence politics in Greenland and maybe cut deals with the Greenlanders. But it seems like the Trump administration has kind of overplayed its hand on this, because there is no appetite in Greenland to become part of the US. The country wants independence, right? It doesn't want to be part of another country, another colonial. It doesn't want another colonial master to come in and take control. And at that, a colonial master that's not going to provide Scandinavian level welfare, free education, subsidized housing, things like that. So I don't know. I mean, maybe there will be room in the future for some negotiations with the US. A lot of Greenlanders want the ability to negotiate other foreign relations independent of Copenhagen. They definitely want that. But there was just elections in Greenland last week, and the party so the runner-up in the election, bit of a surprise, was the most sort of fervently pro-independence party on the island. So that's significant. But the party that won was the most moderate pro-independence party, which means they actually don't want independence right away. Before they want independence, they want a stronger Greenlandic economy, sort of better foundation for sovereignty than they have now. Half the Greenlandic government budget comes from subsidies from Denmark, and that has to be replaced by something else before independence. So all that to say, I think the Americans did have an opening with Greenland, and I think it might be too early to say, but it looks like they might have overplayed their hand by basically treating the Greenlanders disrespectfully and trying to batter them over the head with this sort of new colonialist rhetoric.
It's very you're so calm in the way you describe it that the US may have overplayed their hand. Yeah.
I also say that because Donald Trump, the way that he negotiates and the way he presents his policies is in extremes, right? He sets out an extreme negotiating position, and that's kind of what he's done with Ukraine as well. That's what he did with Zelensky, calling him a dictator, berating him in the White House. Now what we're seeing today is, yes, he's definitely playing to a domestic audience, but he might also be playing to the Ukrainians, right? And Russia didn't get, according to the White House readout, Russia didn't get everything they were after. And that leaves some room for the Ukrainians also to move and be like, okay, and maybe repair relations with the Americans. And this is what Donald Trump does this all the time. He stakes out a position that's completely unrealistic, and then he gets something, in between the starting point and that point, which is why I say that maybe there is some room for stuff to be gained in Greenland as well.
And I just wonder, I'm sure everybody saw the conversation between Trump and Zelensky. Hands up if you were just all dying inside. Yeah, everybody, okay. Just one more question to you, Sune, because it's interesting when you talk about this idea that Donald Trump, he throws it all out there and then things can't just fall into place. But obviously, and from your experience reporting on them, you were nominated for a Pulitzer within the packaging within what the Wall Street Journal had, how you were reporting on it. That was one of Donald Trump's withdrawals in Afghanistan, yeah. And he was behind that initially, and we saw how that ended. It fell apart. It was an utter car crash. That's an understatement. So this idea of throwing so much out and then maybe taking back and minimizing it, what we saw in Kabul was, and as we know now with the Taliban, it's really dangerous.
But it didn't really fall completely apart under him. It fell apart under Biden.
Sure, but didn't he start laying down the foundations?
Oh, absolutely. Laid the foundation. Biden inherited a completely impossible situation, definitely. But the way that a lot of people remember it, Trump supporters, for example, and the Biden administration has its, has its share of the blame as well for the chaos that unfolded in August of 2021. You rightly point out that, of course, this happened because of the foundation that was laid by the Trump administration, but political memory among voters is short, and you can spin this in many different ways, right? And Biden was the face of the chaos, and America faces the chaos in Kabul those months. So yes, it is dangerous. That was your question. Yes, it is dangerous when you throw out these things and you try to create a lot of chaos. I think it can have kind of unfortunate consequences, of course, yeah. And I think that's what we're seeing with NATO, right? I wonder where we're going to be in 3 to 4 years. Which are
It's yeah. I was at the Madrid summit a number of years ago. I forget now. It all seems to blend into one, doesn't it? But that was the day that the NATO summit was saying in Madrid that Russia is an issue. It's a problem. It's a threat. And yet now, my goodness, and that was under the Biden administration, I think that was 2023. And yet now we're seeing something completely different. And arguably, I wonder, Nina, from your experience with the US broadcasters, how they are coping with another Trump presidency, because I think we're all struggling with working out what he means when what he says, how much is true, how much is, to Sune's point, him just throwing it all out there, and how much genuinely will stick.
Well, we care a lot about what happens in Europe and Europe's security because we're very close to the action here. We're very close to the action in Afghanistan as well. And many US partners felt aggrieved that they were left in the lurch there with big consequences when the US pulled out so chaotically, albeit under the Biden administration. They would feel very aggrieved if the United States pulled out of Europe's security, and in particular forced a botched peace deal on Ukraine, because it could have huge implications for waves of migrants coming from Eastern Europe, again, to test the EU and NATO's borders. But if you're across the Atlantic in the United States, you're perhaps dealing with weapons of mass distraction, as I might call them, in the form of DOGE, Elon Musk and his army of federal bureaucratic, vampire slayers, let's say, shall we, who are causing absolute chaos to the federal bureaucracy. There are lots of Americans, who live a lot closer to the breadline than we do here in parts of Europe, who rely a lot more on the welfare state, or who might have voted for Donald Trump because that $700 at the end of the month really made a huge difference to them. And now they're completely embroiled in this new world order with these techno-libertarians, grabbing the news agenda domestically and also affecting how much money they have at the end of the day in their pocket. And I think a little bit like the days when we weren't talking about weapons of mass distraction, we were talking about weapons of mass destruction, dare I say, when we had a Labour government in the UK back in the days of the Iraq War. Fatigue sets in when it comes to foreign military adventurism, and unfortunately that is part of the situation that Donald Trump is also trying to deal with here with regards to the Ukraine war. It's a bit like what happened with Iraq and also Afghanistan.
And it has a tangible consequence, and Catherine, no one better than you will know what it means for places like Dobrobylia. You were there in Ukraine, the city where, can you categorically say that the strikes on Dobrobylia, most recently in the news, were due to the US from stopping sharing the military intelligence, the Maxar satellite imagery? Can you say that the two are definitely intrinsically linked?
Look very much like it. I mean, obviously there's a level under which you can't necessarily penetrate. So without that intelligence, it made it much harder for the Ukrainians to pinpoint exactly where those strikes were coming from, especially when they were within actual Russian territory rather than Russian-controlled territory. And it had a particularly deleterious effect on the campaign in Kursk, which we've now seen more or less collapse, the Ukrainian side more or less collapse. Those are all direct corollaries of the withdrawal of that intelligence sharing, which was for that period much more significant than the halting of military aid, because there was already stuff up front and it was really too short a time. But yeah, that was a pretty dramatic demonstration. I can't say this for sure, this is entirely speculation on my part, but something Trump said after those strikes happened in Dobrobylia made me think, God, he actually, there's a curious sort of prick of conscience I think he does get. I believe him when he says, I want to stop the killing. When he says things like that, I think there is something that bothers him. And remember, the only time he's actually launched military action that wasn't in a sort of state-to-state way, rather than against terrorist targets, or, Soleimani, the Iranian general, I suppose that was state-to-state, but it was an assassination. But if you remember, he was affected enough by some of the chemical attacks in Syria to strike the Syrian military infrastructure. It wasn't huge, but he hit an airfield and hit the place where those attacks were launched from. Right after those strikes, he said Russia is pulverizing Ukraine, and for the first time actually raised the possibility of additional sanctions. So for the first time, he was actually talking about sticks rather than carrots for Russia, and I thought that was interesting. And I think it could be a hopeful note that he can be affected by those things if he sees that his actions have such a direct and immediate, if he can draw the line between them. But as you say, he so often dodges the culpability for what he does, or gets out of a process, or about, the talks he had with Kim Jong-un that he just gave up on, despite the fact Obama had told him that, that he might be dealing with World War III and, where that was concerned with the North Koreans. But yeah, the Afghanistan thing, I mean, if he truly believes he won that election in 2020, he would have still been in the White House when the troops withdrew from Afghanistan, and he would have had to own that. Now, as you say, yes, the Biden administration made mistakes of its own, and the military certainly did, and the manner of the withdrawal was appalling. But I think the end result would have been the same: a Taliban government, and what we've seen happen under that government in Afghanistan. So, yeah, he's quite clever at not owning the outcome, but it doesn't mean he's not affected by it.
So you're giving him a conscience, and he's human. We think you're giving him a conscience, and he's touched by, we see the absolute misery and tragedy. So just to push back on that, Catherine, the Gaza film, and anybody who missed the Gaza film, he replayed it. So somebody had done this fake AI Gaza Riviera, turned it into, gold fountains, and then at the end, Putin and Donald Trump just relaxing by a sun lounge, or however it ended. Okay, it wasn't generated by him, and he obviously is touched by the catastrophe that is Gaza and the absolute sheer misery that is happening on the ground there. And today, again, we once saw the ceasefire falling apart, and yet he still replayed that on Truth Social. So yes, potentially he has a soul and he's touched by these things, but then he does something like that.
Oh yeah, but I mean, okay, I have a personal theory, which is that he just loses his shit when he sees prime real estate. That's what he thinks of when he sees he really does just lose all. So he probably thinks this is a great idea and this would be fantastic for Gazans. He doesn't understand, he has a very shallow appreciation of all issues of geopolitics and international relations. We know this from his first term, and all the grown-ups who will no longer work for him, which is why this term is so dangerous. They've all written their books about it and talked about his, millimeter deep understanding of these things. He doesn't understand that if you take Palestinians out of Gaza, you destroy the legitimate aspiration for a Palestinian state. He just thinks, well, why wouldn't they want to go and live in nice condos in, he even suggested Saudi Arabia. Now that really riled up the Saudis, that they were not up for a bunch of Gazans coming and building condos sort of next door to Neom or something. He has almost a childlike approach sometimes to problem solving that doesn't really take account of the human dimension in terms of sort of national aspirations and stuff like that. But I do still think that when he sees children being blown up or hit with chemical weapons, something seems to respond in him. Maybe good can come of that.
And he's man in a rush, because unless he manages to change the 22nd Amendment in the United States Constitution, he's only got the 2/3 of a term left to do something about all of these intractable problems in the world that he appears to have styled himself as the savior of. And remember that obviously the midterms are coming up in something like a year and a half, and that can really hobble a US president. So he's a man in a rush, isn't he, whether it's Gaza or
particularly
Ukraine.
if he doesn't seem to care whether there's a recession or not. He thinks that's worth it because you have to break things. Well, the American electorate might have something to say about that when it comes to the midterms.
Yeah, they don't like it when it affects their wallets. There are so many different topics, and I do want to open this up to you guys. So do have straight away. Okay, let's go. If I could just, because there's a lot to discuss, if you could keep your questions brief, but thank you, sir.
Thank you. Hi, Luc Marchand, Canadian citizen. I do some Ukraine advocacy stuff. That's about it. So in the tenor of the discussion tonight, I keep noticing that people seem to be treating Trump like he's currently constrained by standard electoral factors that affect most presidents. But let's remember that in 2021, he was perfectly fine with a mob killing his vice president if it meant he would keep the presidency. This is not a normal presidency. The Doge stuff gets headlines, but it's a fast-forwarded version of what Roosevelt already wants to do. And those wheels are in motion. The Roberts Court today has picked a fight with the US over its right to impeach judges for rulings he disagrees with. Why are we still treating Donald Trump like he is a normal man or a child who can't understand morality except for brief bursts when he sees something on TV, rather than someone pursuing an authoritarian project?
Because he was an elected, sorry, and I'm going to cut you off there, because he was an elected, democratically elected leader. I mean, you know, we watch elections all the time. You can't argue with that.
But I'm not saying that he's illegitimate.
Could I take up the point about Roberts? I mean, I think that's, if people aren't across this, it's the Chief Justice Roberts made a pushback pretty firmly on Trump when he said that a judge should be impeached for trying to block him deporting Venezuelan gang members. And I think that what Roberts did is a sign of a functioning democracy, and that is a check and balance. The fact that the judge did make that ruling to block the deportation. Now, what's not normal and is a problem is that Trump felt able to ignore that ruling. And there is a very big problem that we may see more of in the coming, the rest of the term, is who enforces these judgments? It's meant to be US Marshals. What if they don't? One thing that I think is very disturbing is the complete lack of political pushback, not only from the Democrats who seem in disarray and unable to do it. I don't think Schumer was necessarily wrong to stop the government shutdown, but what is very disturbing is the behavior of the Republican Party. And you really wonder how far Trump has to go before they start turning against him. And it's really, really nasty, because these people are, I mean, look, his first action to pardon the January 6th rioters. The Republicans know, and Democrats know, that if they publicly go against Trump, their lives could be in danger, because he's just let a bunch of people out of jail who tried to hang his vice president. So to say they're in fear of their lives is not an exaggeration. I mean, everyone in Washington has got security up wazoo, nothing like what they had before. All these people that Trump took their federal security away from, Fauci, was it Pence as well? It was certainly several of the generals, Mattis.
Yeah.
I mean, that is really disturbing. So yeah, I agree, those are the disturbing things, but unfortunately, they sort of have to happen before you react, because he is a democratically elected president.
And where are the Democrats, arguably? You wanted to come in on this.
Yeah, I would also say, like, if we're the conversation until now, we've sort of been discussing Trump in a European, in a global arena, the context, and I think you have to view Trump differently if you view him internationally. You're completely right in everything you said. He's a president with totalitarian tendencies at the very least. But the global arena, that when we're talking about Ukraine, Russia, Gaza, and Israel, like, Trump is not, he is curtailed in a different way, because he doesn't have absolute power. He has way less power internationally than he does at home, simply because he is beholden to the behavior and geostrategic calculations of Vladimir Putin, of Benjamin Netanyahu, of the rest of NATO, of the EU. And that's why I think it's also, like, when we sort of try to read his mind and try to sort of work out what his calculations might be, is also because he might overplay his hand, like I said, with Greenland, or he might misstep in a way, or he might be. I actually think the whole Gaza thing is a little bit of a distraction. I don't think he actually meant to reset all these Palestinians. I think it was a way of flooding the zone. Everything came at the same time, right? In the early days of his presidency. And I think that's important to remember also, that his actions internationally have different consequences than they do at home, because he's up against people with actual power in their countries, and American power is not infinite. in Europe. And you see now, maybe we can discuss that a bit later, but you see Europe regrouping in an almost historic way, right? And that they're doing that directly. Yeah, you can say it's about time, right? But it's really interesting what's happening in Europe now, and that's happening because of Trump's sort of.
It's interesting.
behavior.
I think the questioner there said you were Canadian citizen. Yeah. So obviously we just had Mark Carney in town. I was out last night with an old friend who's now suddenly found himself a foreign policy advisor. That all happened very quickly. I think we're going to see a Canadian election much sooner than November. Much sooner than November, because it's never going to get as good as this. The Liberals were out; they were on the point of destruction, and Trump has brought them right up again. So you know, other countries, their domestic electorates, they can rebel against what Trump does and change what's going on, not for the better, because he didn't want another liberal.
Like, how's this going for Nigel Farage, the Trump president?
But
right?
just to the point on Mark Carney, and I don't want to sort of pick on Mark Carney, but he has no political experience, and he suddenly becomes the leader.
He's not even an MP.
He's not even elected. So you know, where's your democracy there? But let's move on. There was the firstly this. Sorry, say that again.
We do have the same Westminster system.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Right, this gentleman here.
Sorry, just on that though, you couldn't draft in someone like Carney.
You need
They would
to
have to be an
elected,
MP
yeah.
first. One of the reasons they need to have an election is because he's got to become an MP under your system. But yeah, even to be able to do it is extraordinary.
Could I just point out that Carney is also very economically literate? And one of the points that you were making there about why is the world deferring so much to Donald Trump? Yes, you pointed out, Kasia, that he's democratically elected. He's only got this term to get on with it. But the reality is that he has the Trump card. He has the world's foremost reserve currency, the most powerful military at the helm, and at the helm of, and also the most profitable, and advanced technological companies. And that is the Trump card that Donald Trump has. But Mark Carney's in a good position to be able to play against that, because he's probably one of the most economically literate people that there is in the world, when he's getting buffeted with double-digit tariffs.
Yeah, and he certainly, just had his hands full with the crash, didn't he, when he was a Bank of England chairman? Yes, sir.
Hey there, Theo Thutmanis, freelancer. I'm just back from Ukraine earlier in the month. Is there an opportunity for Europe to simply buy American assistance for Ukraine in terms of weapons, intel, sanctions on Russia, without American political involvement going forward?
That's a really good question. Who wants to pick that up?
Happy to kick it off.
It's almost like we're going in that direction already, isn't it? Yeah, Catherine.
So I mean, this issue of if American military aid to Ukraine were to stop tomorrow, arms manufacturers in America would really feel it. And so there's been this kind of groundswell in Europe about, is that how we could keep engaged? So the money we use, should we send to America to buy their weapons, so we kind of keep them on side? Now, the peril in that, I think, is you can end up in a situation like Ukraine is now in with Starlink, where that keeps being raised as a potential threat. Oh, we could just cut it off. Now, one, that would be bad for a private company to do, because are you going to want to buy Starlink if you're in, I remember being out with a drone team in Ukraine on the Kursk border, and the signal kept cutting out as they were flying this drone over, and they would turn and say, oh, Elon's just, flexing his money, he's showing off by cutting it. But they do constantly feel like that if Elon's in a bad mood, that could go tomorrow. And that's not a great way to run a global company. So that is an issue. But yeah, if you are accepting that, America is not going to take that leadership role in the world, do you pacify Trump by continuing to buy weapons that need American maintenance and contracts and all that stuff? Or do you actually start to think it's time for us to completely separate ourselves from the system economically and politically, because they're too interwoven?
And I've just edited a show on Germany and interviewed a lot of Christian Democratic Union politicians. Obviously, Friedrich Merz is likely to be the next chancellor from the CDU. And this is an acute point of nervousness for Germany that obviously finally is going to play a much bigger role in Europe's defence and spend. In fact, just today, the Bundestag lifted the spending breaks to try and rearm. And there's an $8 billion or potentially more contract with Lockheed Martin on the table for F-35 fighter jets from the United States that Germany is now, very concerned about because they fear that there could be a kill switch in some of these US weapons. In fact, there's and the Portuguese, yeah. But the other issue is that you're starting to hear from a lot of CDU politicians that basically this whole talk of undermining NATO because people aren't stumping up enough cash as portions of their GDP, Germany in particular, is just a ruse to try and stimulate the US defense industry. And I think you're hearing a lot more European powers now finally with that Franco-German axis locking together with Merz coming in tandem with Emmanuel Macron to try and create some kind of, bigger, better, balanced, more efficient European machinery to try and push back against buying more US hardware.
So inadvertently, and this is something that we talk about a lot, Trump has mobilized the EU and the coalition of the willing, however Keir Starmer describes it, to act and embolden themselves. This gentleman had his hand up for a long time, yeah.
Hi. On the point about Trump and being democratically elected, you can be democratically elected and then use the system to turn it into a fascist state. I mean, look what they're doing with university protesters as well, right? I just wanted to get the panel's thoughts on this American disengagement and us sort of sorting ourselves out. So I'm based in Paris right now. This minerals deal, maybe it's BS or to what extent that how much there is and how much can actually be accessed. It's there, it's been put on the table. Ultimately, I feel like we need to deal with Trump as he is. If it's just business, then if France is offering military financial support, as is the rest of this coalition of the willing, and potentially a nuclear umbrella, surely Zelensky should turn around and say, well, look, if there's no security arrangement, we should do this minerals deal with France. And if they want to subcontract it to other partners in this coalition of the willing, great. And even if America wants to get involved, great, provided there's a quid pro quo on whether that's intelligence or air recon or whatever.
I think there was movement on that. And if we could just start passing the microphone down to this gentleman, there was movement on that. But then suddenly the conversations went over the heads of Zelensky and the rest of the EU. This gentleman here with his hand up, please. Wasn't there? Because there was a possibility of that going further. But also, this conversation with getting minerals out of Ukraine, that is a decades-long thing. It's not going to happen overnight. Anyone want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I can pick up.
Yeah, I mean, I was at a Ukrainian titanium mine about 3 weeks ago. I think it's more totemic for Trump to go, look at me, I'm so great, I got you something. I mean, he keeps saying, I will look stupid if I just let them take all that stuff. So it's more for its symbolic value. He'll be dead by the time they get anything out the ground in Ukraine. But in terms of whether you, and I think one of the big problems, and again, these is Europe waited far too long for what was inevitable. You could see this coming a mile off, and they didn't prepare. I've heard, I remember having these discussions with EU officials a year before Trump's inauguration, and they were saying, well, what do you expect us to do? And I'm like, I don't know, maybe talk about what you're going to do. And they kept saying, oh, it's hard to pull out of NATO, and not realizing you don't need to pull out of NATO. You need to just not do anything. But in terms of could you just do a deal with the French and have them use the umbrella and stuff, I mean, there is a really basic problem of resources, of military resources, that even this coalition of the willing couldn't, and this is the shocking state of defense in Europe, they can't do it without the American air support at the very least, even if you had the ground. And you can't change that overnight. And the other problem with money is, everyone, as you say, why is Trump suddenly asking everyone to put it up so high so quickly? It's because the only place with capacity to manufacture those weapons is the US. And even if you wanted to spend that money in Europe, there isn't a capacity right now. That's one of the reasons you've seen the Ukrainian domestic arms industry just ramp up incredibly in the last 3 years. So they're actually producing a lot more domestically, and that's maybe a model that Europe should be looking towards.
And there's an interesting also I'll pick up. Remind me if I forget about the minerals, but there is an interesting model sort of championed by the Danes in Ukraine that they call the Danish model, which is basically the Danish government and also other European governments, the Swedes, I think the Dutch kind of joining in, paying Ukrainian defense firms to produce the weapons that they think they need, tailored to their frontline needs inside Ukraine.
Yeah.
So basically, these are not companies. These are not contracts between Western companies or Western governments and Ukrainian companies. These are contracts between the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian defense firm that's just financed by foreign countries. So that's one. I mean, that's not going to solve the entire problem. That's one sort of creative way out of this. And I think we should. I mean, I totally agree that Europe moved slowly. Europe has sort of obvious, glaring deficiencies, air defense being one, intelligence being another. But Europe also has very formidable navies, armies, and air forces that far sort of outstrip. I think standing armies are 1 to 3 with the Russians, and twice as many armored vehicles. And so I think it's also worth recognizing that if it really came down to it, I mean, Europe is actually sort of a formidable military power that could stand up to Russia.
But that's World War III, isn't it? That's what we're looking at
And I think
realistically.
a lot of that would hinge upon Germany, obviously, because as you pointed out, France has actually been talking about this since 2017. Emmanuel Macron's first Sorbonne speech, where he talked about Europe needing to wake up and smell the coffee, was in 2017. That was just after Donald Trump was elected in his first time in office. And nobody can blame Donald Trump for not saying he's going to do what he's going to do. That is one of the typical things that we know in his first term and this term in office. He signals it way in advance. And Emmanuel Macron, with his big sort of welcoming bromance and so on and so forth, had noticed this. He made 2 famous speeches about how Europe needed to get its act together, think more about creating its own military independently or in tandem, as you said, with NATO, and develop more strategic autonomy and better weapons. Later on, he famously accused NATO of being brain dead, but he didn't have a strident German government by his side that would be able to pick up that message. And now finally that might happen. Yes, it's late in the day, but it is starting to kick in, I think, when we get the government together in Berlin.
I think we need to pick up on NATO as well, so don't let me forget that. But yes, sir, you were waiting patiently and the microphone is coming to you.
Thank you very much. Ewan Grant, UK Defence Forum. I've been doing a lot of radio interviews, mainly LBC News on the war, and I have been stressing the need to keep a watch on the bend of the Dnipro and the river line, because of course if he can get that, he can still threaten, at least in theory, Odessa and of course the net. My question for you all, and I would just say I've already heard more than enough to justify coming today, thank you very much. Turkey. Now Turkey has been attending some of the European meetings in person and apparently virtually. The head of SIS in the UK is a former ambassador to Turkey, and Turkey has the Straits. So how significant do you think Turkey is in all this, particularly now that apparently they seem to have freed up resources on the Kurdish front?
Excellent question. Who wants to pick up on that? I wanted to just even talk about Hungary, but let's speed it forward to Turkey, because
Hungary is a very, very dark story.
And we'll,
if you want some names, let me give them to you.
maybe that's for the bar after. I will pick you up on that. Turkey. How do you solve a problem like Turkey? Because this is, sorry, cheap joke, but it is an issue. It's a NATO member and it is an issue.
Again, I remember covering one of the NATO summits here in the UK, when obviously Emmanuel Macron yet again picked up an issue with Turkey when Turkey bought those Russian missile defense shields. And now Emmanuel Macron, I believe, if I'm not wrong, has actually sold something similar to Turkey, and that's irritated Greece, because then he sold the fighter jets to Greece as well, so they feel sold out by Emmanuel Macron. And that just speaks to the division inside NATO and the division inside these European partners that are going to have to come together to try and, mount some kind of security along the eastern border. Turkey's been so interesting. I've followed Erdogan's government ever since one of his first elections, and I spent a lot of time reporting on Turkey. And what's so interesting is that Turkey obviously isn't mineral resource rich. In fact, it had to subsidize huge deficits when it had to import huge amounts of oil. But Erdogan realized that he could get technology on his side. If he could use sort of proxy wars in places like Libya, failed states like that, to develop drone technology, that would give him a diplomatic edge. And it's given him a diplomatic edge in the Middle East. It's also given him a diplomatic edge in Ukraine, where the Bayraktar drone, which is made by Baykar, that's run by his son-in-law, that famous drone-making company in Turkey, has made such a difference. So I think Turkey sort of propelled itself onto the technological stage in grand fashion, and that's made it a far more important player in NATO. And obviously it's extremely ambiguous when it comes to allowing Russian oligarchs to do business in Turkey, and that's a real irritation to those who put sanctions on Russia to try and squeeze it back to the negotiating table on Ukraine, to no avail, as we've established this evening.
It feels like we're at the bequest of arms dealers, aren't we? Everything is being done by those who are making so much money trading in arms, and to the detriment of everybody else. If we can go some over there. Does anybody want to just reflect on Turkey, or shall we carry on?
I think we could say that there could be, the other role that Turkey could play and has played within the Ukraine conflict is the fact that, it has balanced relations between America and Russia in the past, despite being a NATO member. And it did host the first Istanbul talks. Firstly, Istanbul talks in the very early part of the invasion to actually end the invasion, but also the deals over allowing the Black Sea ports to export grain. So although Turkey is a problematic country, to say the least, and can play a spoiling role as well, there is room for it. And they're not happy, by the way, that the talks the talks that happened between the US and Russia first happened in Saudi Arabia. They'd much rather that they happened in Turkey. And I think the reason they didn't was because Turkey is a NATO member. So that does, I don't think there's any impulse in Turkey for them to leave NATO, but it's slightly irritating to them that it could get in the way of playing that mediating role that makes Erdogan look kind of powerful on the world stage.
You mentioned, I think, the Kurds, and we should. You mentioned the Kurds, but we should watch Turkey's role in Syria. And Turkey has long been vying for this role as a mediator in the Middle East, and it's actually to some extent now succeeding in Syria, where it might be pushing out Russia, or Russia has other things to do. But with the deal with the Kurds, for those of you who haven't followed, basically the PKK leader who's imprisoned in Turkey for many, many years has told the PKK to lay down arms. You also have the Syrian Kurds agreeing to be sort of integrated into the new Syrian state, which is huge if that actually comes to pass. And that will give Turkey, which already has strong relations with the HTS Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Damascus, a bigger role to play in Syria and in the Middle East. And that will play into everything you guys mentioned about Turkey's role inside NATO and as a sort of a mediator between Russia and the US, maybe to the better. I just wanted to pick up on because I promised you about the mineral thing, and it's not like a super insightful thing, but I think it's just worth remembering also that a natural resource deal with the US in return for security is always, relative. And you can ask the Saudis about that. Like the Saudi Arabia's obviously for decades had relations with the US rooted in natural resources. But when the Iranians attacked a few years ago, the Saudi Aramco, there was no response from the US, right? So I asked the Saudis how much those guarantees are worth, and the Ukrainians are fully aware of that, right? Like you get a security guarantee until you know it gets
You need it.
until it gets too spicy.
That's what I'm saying. Even if it's just pure PR and this whole thing's kind of fabricated as a win for Trump if he gets it over, even if we just take him at his word, even though we know that there's nothing to be had there, even symbolically, if France step in and do that, it gives you a kind of leverage in a sense, no? Or it shows that you're standing up for yourself. Plus, if you frame it in this dialogue of you need to pay for your own weapons, Europe, or we can say, well, we're paying for it with this deal. That's good business, as you framed it yourself. And we're actually offering troops and money and potentially nuclear.
That doesn't get around the problem of where you spend the money on the weapons, and that's where we're stuck. I think that's a very hard circle to square.
And not to mention that when you're talking to one EU country, you're talking to all the EU countries, and you've always got Hungary who will always say, no, I will come to you, madam, to this gentleman first, and then to this lady. There's an awful lot to discuss, isn't there? We're not going to solve it in one and a half hour, are we? Yes,
I
no.
thought we were meant to solve it.
Solving.
If you don't have a solution, don't do a presentation. Yes, sir.
Hello, Andrzej Radzki. So probably to Kasia and I think the question would be, what are the threats, like a SWOT analysis of building a united military system of Europe, like the unity? Because unfortunately, I think just a short comment, with the Polish government current one, I'm more positive, but if the current government fails and law and order and confederation come to power, I think it will be like a mess, because these guys before like mainly made Polish military development dependent on the US side and South Korean, so logistically not European. They were opposing any deals with Germany, definitely. And I remember the Lech Kaczynski said that, what would you say about the NATO bases in Poland? That's fine, but I can't imagine that could be the German soldiers. They are like Bundeswehr. And therefore, I think there is a threat on the eastern flank, or in the center, a very key player of building this system. So how could it develop if Putin meddles and this confederation parties like AfD in Germany, right? It's a kind of a Russian party in Poland, rising in power, unfortunately, maybe not that formidable, but still, and building on kind of Ukrainian resentments from the Second World War.
Polish military infrastructure is hugely important for containing
Absolutely, right,
the,
yeah.
the
If you
Ukraine
are going
war
to be
where it
this
is,
like
but
key
it's
player.
not just Poland, isn't it? At the north of Poland, you've got
Yeah,
the
but
Suwałki
without-
corridor, and then further south, you've got Romania has huge NATO bases as well, and we just had all the kind of furore surrounding the blocking of Kalin-Georgescu as a candidate there after he got through to the first round. I mean, concerns that he was essentially a Russian stooge, something he denies, but it has big implications for, as you said, sort of who this military hardware's hands and it ends up in, right?
Yeah, because it's okay and thank you very much for your question. If we just get the microphone back to my esteemed colleague, because, there is, for the first time, a US presence, a US military presence in a former Soviet bloc country. And I'm thinking about, especially around Yashonka near Krakow, which the US military, they can't pronounce Yashonka, so they call it J-Town, which is a nice touch. But the point being, I very much doubt that Poles would want to see German troops within their country, and that's a really interesting point that you raise. But would they, if you're facing a third world war? I think things might change, and exactly that. And if we are going in the direction of travel, I mean, anybody who's got, the further east you go, the more worried people are. The further west you go, it's like, oh, it's fine, it's going to be okay. Madam, yes, please.
So, maybe it's Friday night with Philp to discuss this, but I want to ask questions about the Russian assets, because I read Libération, Le Monde every day. I spend half my time in France, so I read in French Macron's justification for not why this would break international law, and yet Britain and Keir Starmer and other countries especially threaten, say, yes, this is what seizing Russian assets is for. And you, I know you from the past, you used to go to Russia, you know about this too, Ewan. what is the hesitation for them getting together and using that money? Everybody talks about troops on the ground, boots on the ground, soldiers, recruiting, Poland, as you say. Take that money. And I don't understand Macron's hesitation. I studied in France. I know the difference between French law and UK law, but this is not the time for
It's an
nitpicking.
excellent question, and everybody's nodding, so everybody's going to answer. Let's start with you, Sune.
Well, I think the hesitation and you know, you and I, we can agree and disagree on this, but I think the hesitation is that it sets a dangerous precedent from like a place like London especially, right? Like if you start seizing assets from Russians because you're supporting a country that's invaded by Russia, then you kind of erode your standing as a safe financial haven for all kinds of dealings that you don't normally judge, right? Like you don't judge the moral value of the people who are depositing money in your European capitals. And I think it was said that's the thinking. I think it sets a dangerous precedent.
Yeah, it is much more legally complex than it appears. I'll be interested what Bill has to say about this too, because it's something I've discussed with him too. It is legally complex, but yeah, there's also this reputational issue. You then become a country that people may think twice about investing in or putting their money in because you have set this precedent of seizing assets. And you know, this is why, like, when the UK left the European Union, it had to put all this new sanctions legislation in place because all of this is subject to challenge. You can't just, sanctions aren't purely a political tool, and it's not purely a political decision they can be legally challenged. Now, what my understanding of this is, and I'm no sanctions expert or on this, but is that you can, if you have frozen those assets for good reason, you can use the interest, and that is what's happening. So that's much less of a problem, and I think more of that should be happening because that's the first rank of the way that you can use those assets.
And this model I mentioned, where the Danish model, where Western governments are paying for Ukrainian defense contracts, I think about half of that money comes from interest frozen on the frozen assets. So they are doing that.
I do remember early on in the Ukraine war having conversations off the record with officials in Washington, D.C. under the previous administration where there was talk about, you know, trying to enact anti-terrorism legislation to actually seize these assets for once and for all, essentially to deem them the proceeds of terrorist organizations, which, you know, you would do with, you know, assets coming from the Iranian Revolutionary Guards and Hamas and so on and so forth. And that was one avenue that was explored. But I think the problem that you face, we've all faced recently, and we're all journalists mostly in this room, is that there's a constant press cycle that politicians fall into the trap of needing to feed the beast, ramping up sanctions each time that there's another more egregious attack by Russia in Ukraine. And we've fallen into the trap of there being this huge list of sanctions, and it's very, very difficult for them to actually be implemented. It's one thing taking the interest, helping to pay, it's huge amounts of money and it still helps. But you're already starting to see members of the European Union like Hungary that you mentioned before. Today was in the news because Viktor Orban is trying to lobby on behalf of 3 Russian oligarchs, including Mikhail Friedman, who owns one of the biggest properties here in London, to try and get the European Union to take them off the sanctions list. Now, imagine if the UK government had seized all those assets and sold them off. It wouldn't just set a dangerous precedent for other rich people trying to come to this country at a time when obviously more than 1,000 millionaires have left the UK in the last 6 months or year alone. But what about all the Saudi money that we see in this very postcode? All of that would leave as well. So I think, you know, you're right, it's far, far more complex, particularly in the UK, that relies upon wealth tourism. So do other parts of the world, like, for instance, Portugal, we mentioned before.
We need to hear, I mean, we all know what Bill's going to say, but yeah, it's so logical and yet so complicated, therefore we are where we are. There was a gentleman with his hand up here, please. Yes. Okay.
Hello?
Just speak, it's fine.
All right. So as I'm the only Chinese guy here, so I'm going to bring the question is, the first thing, can I take the reference on Taiwan as it the matter on the Ukraine, because it's like the same thing they treat on Taiwan and Ukraine. Is they never promise any security, very promising security on both countries. Yeah, and then that's the major debate between the people in Taiwan. They always say, "Oh, we don't have the strong promise from U.S. Maybe someday they're gonna abandon us, and maybe even we do the chips really good, and then when we trade it out, we will in exchange for the security of our Taiwan in the event of invasion from China," and that's also stirred a lot of doubt in the people, and it's also happening again in Ukraine. It's just very fortunate that Taiwan is not under attack, but it really makes people think. And
it's interesting, and I just want to pick up on that, because the thing with that is we are never 100% clear what the US means by they will come in and help Taiwan. It's so hazy, and that's how you do it, isn't it?
Didn't they drop their policy the other day? They changed the language on the State Department's website.
So they've totally gone away from it now.
Well, they've moved away from the specific language that they had before, where the United States did not support essentially Taiwan's independence ambitions, and now it's just empty, but we don't know in which direction it would go if the issue was actually forced. And we do know that Xi Jinping has said during his time, his ambition is to unify Taiwan with China. And it doesn't look like he's planning on stepping down anytime soon.
It's the ambiguity, and also if that does, goodness knows what, if Ukraine isn't successful, then it gives the red carpet and a precedent.
It's sort of, so we were talking just before we came up about obviously the phone call because it was happening, and I said, we're kind of in the era of Yalta 2.0. So at the end of the Second World War in Europe, Soviet Union, America and Britain sit down on the Crimean Peninsula, of course, of all places, to divvy up the world in spheres of influence. Now, that does seem to be what Trump is doing with Putin, is he's saying or indicating to Putin, who seems to be the only person he wants to speak to apart from Xi, this top tier of leaders. I'm not interested in Europe anymore, so you can kind of do what you want there. Meanwhile, this aggressive expansionist impulse he's showing in the Western Hemisphere with Greenland, Canada, Panama. What we don't know yet is what he's thinking about China, because he is more focused on China than he is in Europe, which is a good reason to let, kind of get American interests out of Europe and let Putin do what he wants. He sees China as a huge commercial rival, certainly. Whether he views China as a strategic rival in terms of whether he would not want to see China take over Taiwan and not want China to have its sphere of influence. Well, I don't think we know that yet. He's sort of trying to lock down this bit of getting out of Europe, and we still don't know, because one, we don't know if he cares about Taiwan. I think not for its own sake, but maybe if he is, because I think that I think we weren't prepared quite for this Trump term to be so expansionist within his own neighborhood, and to be so, at least for him to voice the desire to expand and be that kind of a president. That was new. So I think we need to watch that, and this idea that we're entering a new era of spheres of influence and great powers, and small countries have nothing to say about it. We don't know what kind of sacrifices there will be for places like Taiwan.
Yeah, weren't they meant to be isolationists? That was part of his campaign.
But of course, the irony is that actually it'll be the Biden policies that protect the United States technology industry that is helping Donald Trump so much.
But he's trying to get rid of them.
But it's the Biden policies originally that
he doesn't like
reshored
the chip program.
Exactly. That technically could have protected America from China grabbing Taiwan and grabbing hold of the key infrastructure that America relies upon.
Yeah. So that makes no sense to me, other than this is the Biden program to boost the domestic production of semiconductors and chips, which is all kind of concentrated in Taiwan. So other than Elon doesn't like spending government money on anything, it just doesn't make sense to me. So
that's why it's normal for Ukraine to be very paranoid, because you ask for all the minerals, and then the next thing maybe, it's over.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah, it's too costly, and then well, just pull back all the support. But it also happened the same thing is that from time to time we can hear the congressman of U.S. blaming Taiwan doing not enough in their own defense, and then because you're so lazy on your own defense, and then maybe when the event's gonna break out, we're not gonna help you.
Yeah.
Or you're not buying enough
really,
weapon
really
from
helpful.
U.S. Yeah, the same thing on Ukraine is happening. I'll just say, very similar.
Just to move away just quickly from Taiwan onto another issue that'll probably bubble up in the next few months with regards to China, and is the fate of Jimmy Lai, whose son has been here on this stage talking about his father on more than one occasion, advocating, for his release desperately. 77 years old. He's been in solitary confinement for 4 years. And despite the amount of shuttle diplomacy we've seen with Sebastian Lai coming back and forth to lobby various governments, Conservative and Labour, it might end up being that Donald Trump is the one who ends up trying to secure the release of Jimmy Lai, a British citizen. And I think that's one to watch there. The fact that Donald Trump may, because we know he likes to solve hostage negotiations.
And look what he did with the American,
A fulcrum point for his negotiations with China.
Exactly. Right, a few more questions. There was a lady here and there was some at the back. Yeah. We've got about 15 more minutes, so.
Cecilia Holter. I wanted to ask, it seems to me that there is a massive shift going on right now within Europe in response to the US. You mentioned that you think he has some empathy, and he's a loose talker. He shares a lot with the press, but action speaks. And to me, the red line of him withholding weapons, knowing that Putin is so aggressive and so genocidal, and then shutting off intel and having people like Tulsi Gabbard, Kash Patel behind him, is incredibly dangerous. That to me was a red line. We are not dealing with a safe Trump, a safe US anymore. People today on X are starting to talk about when will we be speaking about removing the US from NATO. I think it's a whole new day. I have a sick stomach. I find this so dangerous because that also empowers China, North Korea.
I think, sorry, just to that point, and that's a fascinating point. If we get the microphone back there, we'll go through this quickly. Interestingly, UK security services, who are part of the Five Eyes, are not saying that they should not be, too many negatives, but they're not saying they should be withdrawing intel sharing with the US at the moment. So it's interesting. Sorry, I cut you off.
I mean, I think that was, I have to say, it was a worry. I remember in the first Trump presidency, there were discussions within intelligence circles in the UK about whether they should be sharing intelligence. And it was sort of agreed that certain things would go straight to the White House, and that there were times when that stopped and it went through the more professional channels. So that is a worry. I mean, it's all a worry. But I feel I feel that too many people have taken comfort from saying, it's quite difficult for the US to pull out of NATO, and it would need Congress's, approval and stuff. It doesn't have to pull out of NATO. It just needs to make it meaningless. It needs to not respond to Article 5. It, undermine it from within. It's just, it would almost be better if we just knew. I mean, in a sense, it's like what Trump's done with Ukraine in the last sort of 3 weeks or so. Okay, now we know what we're dealing with. We can actually start planning, and that's kind of what people needed, a slap. But I don't think we need the US to wait till the US pulls out of NATO to know that the US is not really in it anymore.
But this is also what we see in France when Macron is talking about whether maybe Europe should have a new French-led nuclear umbrella, which is a whole, that really scrambles the mind, because that will require a complete rethink of the nuclear deterrent, right? And how does that even work in practice? Like, does it mean other European countries should have nuclear weapons on their soil, should be producing more nuclear weapons? That's all logistically, like, it's an infrastructure nightmare, right?
Yeah.
But that is, I think, a sign that European leaders are thinking sort of along those lines, right?
They're keen on it. Andrzej Duda, Poland's Andrzej Duda was talking about it just this week. Right, well, some more questions from the audience before we have to wrap up.
Sorry, I had a question about for Greenland, and in terms of you said that Greenland's economy, needs to be improved before it takes independence from Denmark. What would that look like, though? Would that be complete, I guess, no subsidies from Denmark? Because that seems quite difficult to do, considering the level of quality Denmark has given in its form of welfare.
I think that depends on who you ask, and we're still in quite early stages of sort of discussing Greenlandic independence. The formal steps that need to be taken is Greenland would have to have a referendum, and the second largest party now in the Greenlandic parliament, we're probably not going to be government. They're negotiating for the government coalition now, but they basically want a referendum within the next 3 years. That would, depending on the terms of that independence, let's say that a majority is just, a simple majority. If they approve of Greenlandic independence, then it has to be approved in the Danish parliament, which it most likely, I think, would be. The Danish prime minister said if the Greenlanders want independence, they should have it. And it's 2025. I don't think you're going to have a Danish government sort of denying the Greenlandic people independence if that's what they want. But then you face negotiations, probably not that dissimilar to the UK's Brexit negotiations with the EU, just with different complexities. About 45% of Greenlanders want independence. This is according to sort of recent polling in January. They want independence, but only on the condition that living standards in Greenland don't suffer. Right? So that speaks to your point about how do you maintain a Scandinavian level welfare. And Greenland is a part of Denmark. Like, Greenlanders have exactly the same rights as Danish citizens or citizens of mainland Denmark. Free education, free healthcare. They can go get free education in mainland Denmark as well. There's lots of ties between Greenland and Denmark. I think most Greenlanders are probably not 100% Inuit. There's like sort of mixed, like for decades and decades, all families have been mixed, which presents another quite interesting dilemma: is who gets to vote in this referendum about Greenlandic independence? Do you have to live in Greenland? Right now, if you're a Danish citizen, through and through 100% Dane like me, if I went to live in Greenland for 6 months, I could vote in the Greenlandic elections. Should I have the right to vote for independence? Probably not, right? But who then gets the right to vote? The head of the sort of most fervently pro-independence party, Nalarak, they're called, he has floated the idea of an Inuit register. Basically, it is what it sounds like, an Inuit register, but he hasn't defined what an Inuit is and when you're Inuit enough to be able to vote for independence. He himself is 50% Danish, so that is all very complex. It can get quite sort of tricky and ugly quickly, I think. So there's lots of steps. Like, first you need to decide who gets to vote in this referendum. Then what you want from Copenhagen. I think about 50% of Greenlanders also want Copenhagen to continue paying the subsidy they're currently paying, which is about 700 million euros a year, half of the Greenlandic government budget. So I guess that would be a form of reparations, and you can make an argument that Denmark should pay reparations to an independent Greenland. The Greenlanders or many Greenlanders would make that argument, certainly. But that's a tough negotiation with Copenhagen, because Copenhagen is going to want something in return. Do they want minerals? Well, it's very difficult to get the minerals out of the ground in Greenland. Like you said, it was difficult to get, whoever said that, difficult to get the minerals out of the ground in Ukraine. Yeah. Well, try Greenland, where it's like, I went to southern Greenland a couple of weeks ago. It was like minus 18 degrees. And like, shipping is treacherous because there's floating ice off the coast. Like, there's no roads connecting any of the towns. Like, no one is investing in mining in Greenland. So that's maybe not that attractive. Then you get Denmark, like, now has a voice in the Arctic, has outsized influence in the Arctic compared to, like, considering how small the country is. Maybe would demand to still be a part of the Arctic Council or still have influence in the Arctic. All that is very, very, like, a long way of saying that it requires a very complicated series of negotiations, and we haven't even reached the point of a referendum in Greenland yet.
And I wonder if they do bring in a referendum at some point, once they define Inuit and all the different steps, will they put in a threshold? So you have to have over an amount percentage.
But that is what's so tricky.
Well,
right?
they didn't do it here, and let's.
And also, just on this topic here, what about NATO membership? Greenland is currently a member of NATO. It's not a member of the EU because it voted to leave the EU, but it is a member of NATO. You don't want to be Greenland now and not be a member of NATO, right? So that's also a bit of a tricky one.
Just, there's a gentleman just there before you, but while the microphone goes to him, and then I'll come back to you. President Truman tried to get Greenland, tried to buy, or was it buying? I can't remember.
Yeah, he tried to buy it.
So it's not.
It's not the first time.
It's not the first time. Yes, sir.
And the US has bought other islands of Denmark in the past for like.
And they've arguably got Alaska as well. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Just a quick question. I'm wondering whether you're misportraying the situation a little bit, because what Trump did in choosing Canada, Greenland, and Panama was not haphazard. It is all about trade routes. And before anything happened in Ukraine, many years before that, US was putting sanctions on Russian companies operating in the Arctic Circle for gas and energy resources. This has got a lot to do about Northwest Passage, the warming of the atmosphere, the opening up of the trade routes going across the northern, the Arctic Circle. And ultimately, it comes back to China because it is the quickest way from the Pacific into the Atlantic. If you control the Bering Straits, if you control the Iceland and Greenland and the coastal waters of Canada, you basically have that waterway sewn up. And it seems to me a very coordinated, purposeful thing rather than a blurting out of certain things in the air.
Look at a very good point. Look at what he's doing with the Houthis in Yemen. Let's bring the microphone back here because we've only got a few more minutes left, and I'm sure that there's just down here. Back to this gentleman. Oh, let's get this lady first because this gentleman's already spoken. But yeah, it's a fascinating point, and to your point, it's all interconnected. I'm sure he doesn't do everything without purpose. Yes, madam.
Thank you. We've looked back to Yalta, and I wonder if we look ahead. Do we think J.D. Vance might regret being part of some of those loose and unpredictable conversations like the one with Zelensky? Or do we think, this is all part of a bigger plan?
Well, given the way he addressed the Europeans at the Munich conference, I think it's probably not. But does comment on this?
I'd like to pick up from Catherine's point on Yalta 2.0, which I think is extremely astute, and just talk about it from the other perspective, from the other side of the Atlantic. I don't think we're just seeing potentially the end of NATO as we know it, because America is acting as a Trojan horse, and essentially Europe will create something similar that eventually will sort of take over parts of what we view as NATO's crucial role today. I think it's bigger than that. I think we're seeing the end of Pax Americana. Since 1945, countries embraced American values of democracy, trade, as you pointed out before, and the US dollar system, for the reason that, very simply, it gave them peace and prosperity. And with so many countries around the world invested in that system for generations and our parents' generations, it's very hard when the main proponent and advocator of that system just suddenly turns it on its head, as we've seen so quickly. And I think it's one thing if you're a country that has, as I've said before in this panel, commodities that are priced in the dollar to sell. Donald Trump doesn't really care whether you're a democratically elected person or not. He's made it very clear that actually he does a lot more business more easily with dictators, and he views people like Vladimir Zelensky, who is democratically elected, as a dictator. So obviously the world has turned on its head. But the point is it's all about transactions, but we don't really know who, whether it's J.D. Vance, will come after Donald Trump and what he will value. I think that's the real bind that Europe finds itself in now, because we value different things, we realise. And we don't know how long America will continue to champion these types of changing values.
If only you could fast forward, because if they're going in that direction, and arguably, to your point, these conversations are being held in Saudi Arabia, there's an obsession of Trump and Putin, arguably as well, with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. So if that's the direction of travel, then I can't see the next president changing it, really. Yes, Catherine.
So I come back to the gentleman there. You're absolutely right, and I didn't mean to insinuate that just because taking over Greenland and Canada sounds a bit mad, that it's not strategically thought out. It is, and you're absolutely right. It is about the Arctic. I mean, during Trump 1.0, Pompeo went to the Arctic Council, which is really not a particularly, it's sort of a talking shop. It's quite benign. It's not a particularly strategic organization. It's nothing like NATO or anything. And he started to preach to the Arctic Council about how global warming was a wonderful thing because it opened up all these opportunities. And he was talking about the exploitation of minerals in places like Greenland, because as you point out, as it stands, they're quite difficult to get from under a mile thick ice sheet. Much easier if it melts. You have not just the Northwest Passage, but the Northeast Passage, which is the one that China is particularly interested in. And China keeps trying to get itself recognized as an Arctic power, even though it's got no Arctic coastline whatsoever. And it's really bizarre. I mean, it's at the Arctic Council as an observer. A point of fact, the Arctic Council is entirely paralyzed because they kicked Russia out, essentially, after the invasion of Ukraine. So there's stuff behind it. I think what strikes us as the madness of this is that Trump is behaving as if these countries had no agency of their own and almost no population. It's almost like the way that the Israeli right treat the West Bank. They want the land, but they don't want the people. I mean, I don't think Donald Trump wants the Canadian population involved in American elections, do you? The Republicans would never get back. There you go. So I think this is what seems absolute madness to us, is that he's talking about, I mean, look, if you think about going back again to Yeltsin, I will throw it forward, but, you know, that carve up of the world, that didn't take into account the feelings of any of Eastern European peoples about how they might want democracy. They were just handed over to Stalin. Half of Germany was too. You can't treat sovereign countries like that anymore. It's not the Louisiana Purchase. It's not Alaska. It's not the way that that America managed to expand itself in the time of McKinley and stuff. So, but yeah, this is because there is something fundamentally not democratic about him. Although he's democratically elected, he doesn't respect other people's democracies, and he thinks that powerful leaders like him and Putin should have the power to make decisions over the land where people live.
And we just don't seem to learn from history, from Yalta, from whether it's Yalta 2.0 now. Look at, the Poles they see Churchill as an enemy because of what happened, the way the countries were given over to the Soviet Union. Think about Finland and Finland's Winter War, when they lost 10% of their land to the Soviet Union. And even today on the BBC, we had the leader of Finland saying, you've got to look out for Ukraine. We learned it the hard way. We don't learn though, do we? Sune, and then the gentleman in the green top, and that will be the last one because we've heard from both of you. Yes.
Yeah, I just want to respond to the gentleman down here. I think if I gave the impression that Trump's statements about Greenland would not sort of considered, that was my intention, because he did the same back in 2019, obviously. I think the reason why people think they sound insane is because, well, they're sort of outrageous, but also because he hasn't actually formulated what he wants in Greenland. And whatever sort of rationale we can come up with, doesn't actually make a lot of sense. Minerals, we touched on that, difficult to get out of the ground, no one is investing in it anyway, including people like Trumpian people like Jeff Bezos, who's already invested in mineral exploration in Greenland. Then there's, as you mentioned, the trade routes. Yes, trade will open up in the Northwest and Northeast Passage, but it's going to be a long time before you don't need icebreakers to go through that passage. The US has 2 aging icebreakers. Russia has 40. right? Like there's
China has several.
and China has several, and it takes a very, very long time to build these things. Already now, like people are not like shipping does not go through the Arctic simply because it's bad business. If you're lucky, it takes more or less the same time as if you go sort of south the Suez Canal, but it's a lot more expensive because of insurance, and because if you get delayed, you really get delayed. You're gonna have to either turn around or you have to rent one of these icebreakers to go through. So financially, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And from a security perspective, it also doesn't make a lot of sense. He has a point, which he often does. There's always a kernel of sort of truth and reason when Trump says these things. Greenland is largely unprotected. Denmark is in no position to protect Greenland. Russia could send missiles over eastern Greenland and no one would even notice them, right?
Yeah.
Because it's so large. It's almost 25% of the entire territory of the United States, with 57,000 people living there, right? And Denmark doesn't have a big. Greenland doesn't have a military. Denmark doesn't have a big military, and it has bigger priorities like Ukraine, for example, or the Baltic Sea. But the U.S. has, since the Second World War, had permission to station as many troops as they want in Greenland. They have that agreement with Denmark already, and they have a base in northern Greenland, now called Pituffik. It used to be called the Thule Air Base. And they don't have that many troops there, but they could station as many as they wanted to across Greenland. But they don't. And to your point about how they don't care about the population, when the Americans originally built the airbase in northern Greenland, the Danes forcefully removed all the indigenous people who lived in that area, right? So, I mean, yeah, what was the point?
It's the way it's done. I'm just going to,
Yes.
one last point to the man in the green, and you've literally got a sentence, and then we'll come back to you because we're going to be up against it.
Great,
Sir.
thanks very much. Just circling back to life after NATO or a world after NATO, Article 42.7 of the European Article 42.7 of the European Treaty is a sort of mutual defence clause between European member states, which they've all signed up to. And I'm just wondering if you're any thoughts on that. My own country, Ireland, in fact, is talking about purchasing a fleet or a squadron of fighter jets, should I say? So
Who
huge
from?
changes. Sorry.
Who from?
Well, that's to be decided. It's early stages, but even to make the announcement is incredible. So that's a kind of a separate point. But 42.7, I'm just wondering your thoughts about how real and how committed EU member states might be to that in a life beyond NATO.
Well, speaking of neutral countries, I was reminded on my way here by Google's memories or whatever it is on my phone that about 3 years ago I was in Sweden filming all these pieces about how Sweden had, at lightning speed, decided to turn its back on generations of neutrality and decided to embrace NATO and said, just like Finland, we absolutely cannot afford to be out of the club. And then fast forward 3 years and we're questioning whether or not NATO will actually exist. Ireland itself, that is famous for its neutrality, will now potentially be part of something European that could eventually replace NATO. So it just goes to show how, it's a very European adage, actually. I used to be the Europe editor of CNN, covering many Brussels summits, and the old adage is never waste a crisis, and I think that's a classic example of that. Could I just pick up on one quick thing about Greenland, though, that I wanted to point out, and just to highlight our friend here who lives in Paris will probably know this one. An informative example to look at is what happened about several months ago in Nouvelle-Calédonie, in New Caledonia, territory of France that's all the way down near New Zealand and the South Pacific, an area where China's trying to grab a lot more of those shipping routes. You had one of these changes of the rules in a potential election where the indigenous Kanak population felt that they would have their voices shut out if French people were allowed, ethnically French people were allowed to settle there and vote. And you had a very big disinformation campaign that allegedly Azerbaijan was behind to try and interfere in that referendum. So I think it's quite interesting to just juxtapose the example of other sort of territories of EU countries like France, all the way on the other end of the world where it's quite warm and there are lucrative shipping routes as well that people are very interested in interfering in, with what might eventually happen in Greenland if you have sort of US-sponsored disinformation there and more troops planted.
And we haven't even fully explored disinformation, but it's 8:30. I know you guys want to get to the bar because we can keep this conversation going there. As journalists, we are, as we all know, chasing all of these different soundbite stories. The moment Donald Trump says, tweets, thinks something, we are all over it. Do we need to take a step back? This discussion needs to go on further. Talk to the organisers to invite us back. Thank you so much for your wonderful questions, and thank you to my panel, Sune, Kathleen, thank you so much.